Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched The Crown season 4. Let's talk about it. So the time has finally come where I get to share my thoughts on the latest season of one of my very favorite TV shows ever. I absolutely love The Crown and I look forward to this series every single year when it gets released. So I am super excited to be jumping right into this series today. We're not going to mess around, okay? We're not messing around because there's a lot to get through. I have so many thoughts, but just know going forward that I absolutely loved this season of The Crown. This was a return to form. I remember in the previous season when I did my review for season 3 that I had some issues with it, and just overall I didn't feel like it had that same spice. It had that same sauce that The Crown usually has, especially at the beginning of this series in season 1 and 2. Like, there were moments in this show that just felt legendary, that just felt like instant classics. In season 3 I felt like those moments were few and far between just overall, but here in this season we've returned to the greatness that The Crown once had, and I have so many thoughts on all of the themes and the characters that were explored in this season. But just know that this is of course going to be a spoiler review, and before we dive into my thoughts, be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and make sure that you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Without further ado, let's dive into this one. So first off, we're going to be talking about one of the elements of this series that people were the most excited to see. We're going to jump right into this. Yes, I'm of course talking about the marriage of Prince Charles and the Princess of Wales herself, Diana. Wow. First of all, I just want to address Emma Corrin as Diana. I think her performance here was absolutely splendid, absolutely spectacular. Now, this is such a difficult role to take on, especially as the kind of first role that she's had in a very, prominent TV series or film, because I'm not really familiar with her work in the past. So this is definitely going to be a defining moment in her career. Let me tell you, she really rose to the occasion. I personally think she did the best that she possibly could with the material, and the material was there as well, which we'll get into later on. But aesthetically, she definitely took on the mannerisms of Diana. If there was one little critique, I would say that the head bowing and the eyes up situation was a bit exaggerated. There's a little bit of exaggeration just in general when it comes to taking on the caricatures of these people, because they're so well known for those characteristics. I feel like the actors sometimes overcompensated, but nonetheless I feel like overall the performance was just beautiful. Her performance was consistent throughout, with the cadence of her voice and her accent being almost perfect. I mean, it was really spectacular what she was able to do here just as a performer. So casting her in this role was absolutely a triumph, but I am so looking forward to seeing Elizabeth Debicki being cast in this role. I think she's going to do great, just as Emma Corrin has in this season. And then of course you have Josh O'Connor returning as Prince Charles, who again is absolutely great. I would say again, if there was any criticism when it comes to their performances, the bowing of the heads is a little bit excessive, to the point where I felt bad for his back. There had to be moments where he was, standing with his head held high, because otherwise, just for the sake of his posture, he needed to improve his posture for sure. But I understand that they were adopting the mannerisms of these real life people, but still their performances are absolutely incredible. And I would say that the way that the show depicted their relationship, the way that it started off in this kind of quirky fairy tale way where Diana was being swept up by this entire narrative, and the public was falling for it as well. The public was eating it up. This opportunity to have this story unveil itself as this prince meets this, commoner. I mean, she's not actually a commoner, she has a royal background, but whatever. That's the way the public kind of spun it, and it just became this beautiful story in everyone's minds, and they wanted that relationship to be reflected in real life. And so they believed when they were performing, when the couple was just out there looking so beautiful and so harmonious together, they believed that to be the reality behind the scenes. But then, as we see, there were issues with the relationship from its genesis, and going throughout their marriage it just got worse and worse and worse. And to see the deterioration of that relationship here was just heartbreaking. It was frustrating. It was so frustrating. It was bubbling just below the surface, and then at the very end there we saw the Queen just explode. And I think Olivia Colman was absolutely perfect in that moment, because she was us. She just addressed Charles in the most frank brutal way, where she told him, you guys need to get it together, because it's on both of you, and people just don't feel sorry for you. They're not going to be sympathetic towards you. And it was very much a case where their perception of the public and the way that the public saw them may have been kind of twisted because of the constant praise. Charles especially thought that the public would sympathize with him, knowing that his love for Camilla was greater than his love for Diana, and people would see that. That is not the case. And the Queen saw this. The Queen saw that that is absolutely not the case, that they would just see two spoiled brats who were born into privilege, who were complaining about seemingly nothing. And so the sympathy just wouldn't be there, especially not for Charles. She is very much pleading with him to see reality and to understand the duty that he has as the heir to the throne, someone who has to have that responsibility of maintaining this perfect image of a family because it represents the stability of the crown itself. This is something that Charles didn't understand. He literally did not understand at this point, and that was reflected by his actions and the way that he was treating his wife. Now, once again, this show does such a good job of seeding in this information from the very beginning and showing us that actually these two weren't meant to be. Now, of course, in reality, it's harder to see things as they are happening for the first time, and hindsight is always 2020. And of course, we can look at it from an outsider's perspective and see, like, hang on, that was never gonna work. We can especially see this in that episode where Diana, just after she'd gotten engaged, was left alone in the palace to just kind of entertain herself. Meanwhile, Charles was off. He just completely disappeared. He didn't contact her. There was no communication. There was no show of affection. And in the meantime, she's receiving all of that from absolute strangers who, again, have fallen in love with their love story. But it was just a huge warning sign. It was a huge red flag that this relationship wouldn't work, because he was clearly not as devoted to her and to their upcoming marriage as she was. Now, again, a mixture of obviously, you know, fiction and dramatic license, as well as the fact that this is, you know, hindsight 2020, means that this wouldn't have been foreseeable, or as foreseeable perhaps to the people living that life. But to us, it just makes for this really great progression, or at least deterioration, of a relationship being depicted on the screen. Another thing that I very much appreciated about this season is the way that they depicted Diana pretty much warts and all. This was such a tricky topic to tackle, because Diana still to this day is one of the most iconic members of the royal family, certainly in modern times, and she is so beloved. She has this incredible reputation as being someone so loving and caring and more down to earth than the rest of them, right? So the idea that this show would tackle this person who is so iconic and so legendary in British and indeed international culture is pretty daunting, and I think they did a very good job of showing her as a three-dimensional character as opposed to just this statuesque being who was flawless, because we do see the depiction of her eating disorder, which she apparently had, and it is very difficult to watch. And in fact, the episodes that feature it do have warnings at the beginning of them, which I think was a great choice by Netflix. I think it was definitely influenced by the reaction after 13 Reasons Why, so I appreciate the fact that they included that warning for those people who would find those scenes very upsetting, because even I don't suffer from an eating disorder, but I found those scenes very upsetting. But it was just so upsetting to see this person go through what she was going through, and to see how it affected her psychologically and indeed physically. And I think it was so important to have that there to show that she may not have had the most healthy coping mechanisms for the situation that she found herself in. I think it's so important to see that, especially for people who may be going through something similar to this. They would be able to see, oh my goodness, even someone like Princess Diana would have had those issues, and she dealt with those issues in that way. You know, maybe I'm not alone in this struggle. Having said that though, I will still say that the show for the most part does depict Diana as being the victim, because perhaps she was more of a victim than Charles was. So it's very difficult to kind of see Charles's side of things when he's so clearly the villain in this situation. He is so clearly the bad guy. Him and Camilla are despicable in this season. Listen, I never had any sympathy for him in the previous season. Some people did. You're better than me. I didn't have any sympathy for him at all. But in this season, he was despicable. He was so unlikable, and his whining and whinging and groaning. Meanwhile, everyone around him is telling him the same thing, which is he has it good. Like, he is literally so full of privilege. He has everything that he could possibly want. It's just a case of him being so short-sighted and narrow-minded about his future, because there is no future with Camilla. She's literally married. Also, can we talk about Camilla in this situation? And again, I'm talking about the characters on the show. No offense to the royal family, I'm talking about the characters on the show. Why is she entertaining Charles when she knows that she's married as well? Because there's such a double standard here, okay? There's definitely a double standard that's been explored since the genesis of this show, and especially in season 2 when it was speculated that Prince Philip had an affair. But in this case, we still see that double standard being persisted, with Charles's antics with Camilla being taken as not much of a big deal. It's something that he has to stop, but not necessarily because it's wrong, but rather because he has to think about his duties to his wife, as opposed to the reaction that people have when it's revealed that Diana is also having an extramarital affair. That's very much a bigger deal. That's something that kind of draws the line in the Queen's eyes. And so we do see that double standard play out. But one thing that I am very confused about is the lack of addressing the fact that Camilla is also having an affair. Like, she's also cheating on her husband, and I guess it's kind of justified because he's also having an affair. No one is faithful. No one, literally no one takes the sanctity of marriage seriously on this show. Absolutely no one. I don't even know why they celebrate their weddings. No one is faithful. No one is taking these vows seriously. Even Princess Anne is having an affair because her husband is having an affair, maybe. Like, literally just... So anyways, there's definitely a double standard, especially against women when they have affairs in this royal family. I mean, we had that in the case of Princess Margaret. We also saw that in the case of Diana in this season. But at the same time, I do think that not enough of a big deal was made about the fact that Camilla is also in the wrong here. Like, she's willingly entertaining this relationship with Charles for so long, despite the fact that she knows that he's married and she's married herself, which is... It's a commentary on both of their personalities, if you ask me, and not a very flattering one. So outside of the Diana Charles bubble, we also had the rest of the family. Now, this was a very interesting season because of the heavy focus on Charles and Diana's relationship. We didn't actually get a lot of the rest of the royal family. They very much took a back seat this season, including the Queen herself, which was very interesting. We definitely got more of the Queen in terms of her interactions with Margaret Thatcher, which we'll get into later on. But in the case of, you know, Prince Philip and Anne, they were definitely shortchanged in terms of screen time and in terms of significance to the plot overall this season. But we did still have them featured as pretty much background characters, and they did get up to some interesting things, I guess. We did somewhat explore the deterioration of Anne's own relationship and the issues that she faced there. We also got the all-important introductions of the Queen's other sons. Like, I genuinely almost forgot that she had 4 children. I literally almost forgot that she did until we had that episode where she was exploring her favourite, and it gave them the perfect opportunity to introduce each and every one of these kids and at the point of their lives that they're at. And it was very interesting to see Prince Edward, who is portrayed as somewhat of a snooty and very much up himself kind of prince character. He seems very spoilt. He seems much like a brat, but at the same time, it's kind of somewhat balanced out by the fact that he is mocked and ridiculed and bullied at school because of his position. And so it seems as though he has a vendetta against the people who mock him, and it seems as though because he's being mocked for the fact that he's being a prince, he feels justified in looking down at everyone else and kind of reaping the benefits of being a member of the royal family. And then we also get the introduction to the much maligned member of the royal family, that of course being Prince Andrew. Now, he has become a very contentious and a very controversial member of the royal family because of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, who is known to... You know who Jeffrey Epstein is. We don't need to get into all of that right now, but it does emerge that in this episode, he seems to be the Queen's favourite, and that is something that was kind of rumoured for a very long time. It's very interesting then. That this show tries to tackle kind of 2 birds with 1 stone, because it does establish that he's the Queen's favourite, but it kind of cowards his way out of explaining what her reaction would be, or at least assuming what her reaction would be to the knowledge of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. At this point in time, it's not established if he has a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. I don't believe he does, but it does make it clear that he has sketchy tendencies that the Queen would view as upsetting and worrying. And even though we don't know for sure, I mean, of course, we don't know for sure if the Queen actually knew of his tendencies at this point in time, they use the analogy of the awakening of Emily, who is a 17-year-old who's basically in this like fictional film. They use that as the substitute to the real life controversies that Prince Andrew has faced, suggesting that this tendency was in him from the beginning and it's something that the Queen would disapprove of, even though, again, they're very much taking taken creative license with this because we don't know for sure what her reaction would be to this whole situation. Now, the introduction of Prince Andrew and Prince Edward does mean a further expansion of the royal family, but interestingly enough, what's also explored is the idea that perhaps the royal family shouldn't be expanding, perhaps it should be contracting in order to kind of conserve the wealth and the money, the taxpayers' money, okay, that support the family, in order to make sure that it's going to the kind of center of the family, that being the Queen, the monarch, and all of her heirs. And it's very interesting to note that Charles himself says as much in front of his own siblings. That was cruel. But in front of his own siblings, he basically tells them how irrelevant they are because they're just in the periphery. What really matters is him and his line of succession, which he's established with his two sons. I find that pretty brave that they included that in here because he is known to have this belief in real life. He is known to want to kind of shrink the monarchy so that, you know, funding can be used more effectively and the people can get more value for their money in terms of the taxes that are paid towards the royal family. So that is a philosophy or a belief that he genuinely has towards his family. But I found it very interesting to see the reactions of those family members because that's not something that we do get in real life. The show also somewhat briefly touches upon the impact of Princess Diana's popularity and how that affected the other members of the royal family, in particular the women such as Princess Anne, Princess Margaret, and also what's not explored here at all is how the press constantly compared Princess Diana to Sarah Ferguson, who was Prince Andrew's fiance and then wife. That was entirely left out of this season, and in fact Prince Andrew's relationship with Sarah Ferguson was not much more than a footnote in the entire show, but it was definitely something that was prevalent in the press, of course, because the press loved to pit women against women, and as we saw with Kate and Meghan most recently, there were constant comparisons between Sarah and Diana. And in fact, I know this because Sarah herself said it recently when she was comparing their situation with that of Meghan and Kate. And now we get to another juicy element of this season, and that was of course the introduction of none other than Margaret Thatcher. Wow. Absolutely. Let's get into it. First of all, I think Gillian Anderson's performance as Margaret Thatcher was truly something to behold. I think she did an incredible job. Now again, if I was going to criticize anything as someone who is highly qualified to do so, it would be that I think she somewhat overdid it. Just a little bit. I would say that the tautness of her face and the fact that she was constantly pouting was a bit exaggerative. And I would also say that the croakiness of her voice and the way that her voice was just, it sounded like sandpaper just being grated against itself. Like it was somewhat overdone in that sense. And I did take the liberty of watching a few Margaret Thatcher clips just to kind of gauge how hoarse her voice really was. And I would say that, you know, Gillian definitely overdid it in that front. I think the cadence of her voice, I think her accent was absolutely perfect, but the hoarseness was just a little bit exaggerative. But still, I would say that her performance in this role was Emmy Award deserving at least. Like it was very, very good. And her entire comportment as this character was spot on. This balance that Margaret Thatcher have of presenting herself as this powerful figure. I mean, we're talking the origin of the blue power suits, okay? They were very much manufactured to convey a certain message of power, but femininity at the same time. And that's the other side to her, is this idea that she still believed in these antiquated views of gender roles. And so she still very much felt like she was a mother first, a wife first, while still being prime minister to the country. And she wanted to show that. She wanted to show that even though she had gotten to the position that she did, she still believed that a woman's role was to take care of her husband and to take care of her children. She was by no means interested in the feminist movement or interested in conveying this message that a woman could abandon her wifely duties and her motherly duties to pursue a career. Absolutely not. If you could do both, that's great. Like if you could do both, like she did, you know, she was taking care of her twins and she managed to pursue her career in politics, that's fine. But in the case of abandoning those traditional roles, this was not something that she wanted to convey in the slightest. She very much felt like a woman's priority remained her household. So on this front alone, you can already see that she was a very controversial figure, but then that extended onto her economic policies and her foreign policies, and we have some of that being explored here just fabulously. I would say that the show brilliantly captured the neoliberalism that Margaret Thatcher clung to. She was very much someone who believed that people could strive for the best, that they could, you know, pick themselves up and get to the very top. This was a very capitalistic and individualistic mentality that she wanted to encourage within the public, and she very much believed that those who took on that mentality would get ahead, and those who were left behind kind of had to take care of the situation themselves, because the state wasn't there to help you. The state wasn't wasn't there to give you handouts, and that is of course reflected in her policies regarding the welfare state and the welfare system and how that shrunk under her leadership. Oh, how that shrunk, how that was decimated under her leadership. I can by no means sit here and say that I was a supporter of Margaret Thatcher's policies by any stretch of the imagination. I studied them during university because I did law with politics, and it was fascinating to see. It was fascinating to see her portray herself as such a strong, decisive leader. But I still think, at what cost? At what cost? At great cost to the poor, to the most vulnerable in society. As we see in that episode where that man breaks into Buckingham Palace itself and manages to get himself in the Queen's bedroom, we very much see the reality of how people lived during this time, and the poorest of the poor, people who were living in council estates that were very run down. We saw the reality of her economic policies there, and I think that was so brilliantly done again. I also found the way that the show explored the nuances in her beliefs and ideologies to be absolutely incredible, because it's not just enough that she's a capitalist, right? There's also this element that she's very anti-aristocracy. She's very anti, you know, being born into automatic privilege, despite or irregardless of any of the personal merits and attributes that you may have. She was very much a proponent of a meritocracy in that way, even though she does believe that those who do work the hardest and get to the top very much deserve to reap the rewards of their hard work. But at the same time, she does have a certain kind of resentment or a certain dislike for the old guard, the aristocracy, who are born into that privilege. And I think in terms of the way that this character was portrayed here, it was fascinating to see that even though they had so much alike, there were so many things that the Queen and Margaret Thatcher butted heads on. And in fact, there is this very somewhat overt symbolic moment where in the episode that explores the Balmoral tests, we see that the stag that the royal family has been trying to hunt down is finally caught with the help of Diana, and we see at the very end there that the stag that existed beforehand, kind of like the old guard, is also facing the new one that they managed to get, and it's kind of like this metaphor of butting heads, at least in my opinion. And I think it perfectly symbolizes the relationship that develops between Thatcher and the Queen throughout this season. Now, this very much came to the forefront when the show decided to finally extensively explore the Queen's role in the Commonwealth. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it, because last year when I did my review of season 3, one of my biggest issues with that season was its entire omission of the fall of the British Empire, or the Commonwealth, or whatever they want to call it. During the period that was covered in season 3, you had much of the countries that were under British control, under the Empire, gaining their independence. And I was so upset to see that the show completely omitted that, because that is such a huge deal, considering the fact that the Queen herself is a representation of the Empire. The monarch is at the head of this empire. I mean, previously her father had been called an emperor. And so to see that the show refused to explore the impact of the fall of the British Empire on the Queen's role as the head of the Commonwealth and the head of so many countries was a little bit disappointing. I mean, it's a lot. It was a lot disappointing. And so I was very happy to see the Commonwealth being addressed here, as well as British imperialism being addressed here in so many different facets. So in the very first episode, we do have the presence of the IRA and the very contentious relationship between Britain and Ireland being explored there. And then we also get a little bit of an insight into the anti-monarchist movements in Australia, where we see Charles and Diana make a visit, and initially it's thought that Charles will ruin that relationship even further. But actually, because of the popularity of Diana, their tour ends up being a huge success. But still, the show does point out that there is anti-monarchist sentiment existing in that country, which I think is very important to highlight. And then, and this is something that I'm more concerned about, we do have the presence of the South African apartheid. It's so gut-wrenching. I think the show could have done an even better job of exploring the apartheid itself, but I would say that a major criticism that I have is the fact that it very much shied away from the horrors of the empire still. It very much refuses to explore what it actually meant to have a British Empire and what it actually meant for Britain to subjugate so many people around the world. It seems to be content with celebrating the Commonwealth and creating this very revised version of history when it comes to Britain's role in the Commonwealth. I would still say that the show's refusal to acknowledge the fact that it was British and Dutch involvement in South Africa that started the apartheid to begin with is somewhat disappointing. I will still say that it was so nice to see Claire Foy back in her role as the young Queen Elizabeth in this episode. I think it was such a nice way to end this era of Elizabeth's life, especially because Olivia Colman won't be Queen Elizabeth for seasons 5 and 6 anymore. So it was really nice to see that kind of callback. I don't know if this is old footage that they're repurposing or if she actually went in to film this additional footage, but it was great to see her here, even though I slightly very much disagreed with the sentiments that she was saying about the Commonwealth being a family. Like, this family isn't equal. And in fact, the show itself does acknowledge that, the fact that some countries are more important than others, that being, of course, Australia and New Zealand over the African countries. But they didn't say that. They didn't say that because they're not quite there yet in terms of acknowledging the truth. So those are the main themes and events from this season that I really wanted to sink my teeth into. But for the final part, I just wanted to talk about some of the overall things that I very much enjoyed, or perhaps thought there was an issue with when it came to season 4 of The Crown. So let's start off with the positives. So first of all, as always, the score. The score of this show is absolutely phenomenal. I think even more so this season. Oh, they really rammed it up in terms of the music. I think it's absolutely stunning. And of course, as usual, we also have great costuming and hair and makeup, in particular in the case of Emma Corrin's transformation into Diana. I mean, having her look so much like Diana to the point where it's almost uncanny, like you forget that she's not actually this real life person. I mean, it was such an amazing transformation. I think the hair and makeup department did a great job. I would say that in terms of the costuming, I think the costumes were great, like especially when they were recreating real life wardrobes from these people. I think they were absolutely phenomenal. But I would still say that the style of this time was just so horrible. It was so drab, and that's not really a criticism for the costuming department at all. That's literally just how people dressed at that time. Ugh. With some of the things that they had Olivia Colman wearing, I was like, oh, that's so unfortunate. I think Margaret had way better fashion sense and very much intentional fashion sense, but overall I just wasn't impressed with the style of the day whatsoever. Now, if I was to give any criticisms for the show overall, it would be that I do think it's getting a little too crowded. Now, like I said before, we did have the introduction of 2 further sons of the Queen, and so it expanded the family further, but I don't believe we're going to be exploring those 2 characters with any real depth anytime soon, because we've already seen Anne, who's been on the show now for 2 seasons, be shortchanged time and time again. It's just the nature of the family that you would hone in on the line of succession, and of course the focus is definitely going to be on the further breakdown of Charles and Diana's relationship in the next season. So I don't really see them exploring, you know, more of the outer members of the royal family, and we already see this taking place in the form of Princess Margaret's very much reduced role this season. That's the whole storyline that Margaret got this season. She didn't really get much else, and I think it is reflective of her reduced role both on screen and also in reality because of the growth of Charles and Diana's importance here. And finally, I did want to touch on something that I see often discussed when it comes to The Crown. Now, I often talk about the things that they left out or the things that they should have honed in on more. For example, in the case of Margaret Thatcher, I think it was bonkers. I think it was literally insane that they left out the miners' strike. I think that was an attack on the UK. Just kidding. But it was definitely a huge omission to not even, I think, mention the miners' strike, because that is such a huge part of her career and her legacy, how she pissed off so many miners because she eradicated that entire industry in this country. But anyways, there are so many things that this show leaves out, and I see a lot of people mentioning those things, including myself. One thing that we really must remember when it comes to this show is that it is fictional. This is a drama series for entertainment first and foremost. It's not designed to educate people in a way that a textbook would, or a documentary even. This takes a lot of creative liberties and dramatic liberties in order to create the best series that is watchable by audiences. And it's difficult because it's a series that presents itself as being very accurate, and you hear about Peter Morgan, who, by the way, is Gillian Anderson's partner, which is pretty cool and interesting. But you hear about him having so much of an emphasis on research and doing the most research that he possibly can, and having all of these sources within the palace who have worked there in the past. But that still doesn't mean that the show is 100% accurate, and I think people really need to remember that when they're going in, because it can be harder when things are somewhat presented as truth as opposed to when things are 100% fictitious. So with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving The Crown season 4 an 8.5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on The Crown Season 4, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this season down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel to catch you videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!